Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Canadian Story. I'm pleased to have Fred here. Fred, why don't you tell our guests about yourself, what you do, where we can find you on the internet, and what you're all about?
Well, hi, guys. Yes, I'm Fred Wilson. I'm a retired guy now, but I'm still an activist. I spent my life in the trade union movement, worked for, most recently for Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union, was part of the group that created Unifor in 2013. And served as its first director of strategic planning for the first 3 years before I took retirement. And I've been doing projects as a volunteer with the union ever since. I particularly enjoyed this. I had the immense privilege of working for the labor movement for 30 years. And it always struck me that when I was being paid to work on behalf of our members, that I was always working with members who were volunteering, because that's the nature of the trade union movement. And so, I can just say that when I retired, I was more than pleased to be able to become one of those volunteers. Prior to working for Unifor, I was the assistant to the president of one of the predecessor unions called the Communications, Energy, and Paper Workers Union, and that's where I got my start, is with the CEP. And before that, its predecessor union, the Canadian Paper Workers Union in Vancouver, and that's where I was born and learned my politics. Cut my teeth in the labor movement, working with socialist fishermen and carpenters and loggers, and then I went to work for the union, and eventually was enticed to move to Ottawa to work in the national office. So that's my background. I've always combined my work with the union movement with work in social movements. For 15 years, I was a volunteer member of the Council of Canadians on their board of directors. I've been very active in civic politics back in the day. I spent many, many years in Vancouver, being a campaign manager for the progressive civic organization there. So it's been a life of a very rewarding life of engagement, politics, struggles, organizing. If I had to do it all over again, I would.
I love that. And it's interesting because I'm also a political organizer, but on the conservative side, or not so much the progressive side. But I always talk to my friends when I was a staffer on the Hill, my NDP friends, and I always say, really, when it comes down to it, organizing is a skill set. It's an art, right? It's a thing that you do. And it doesn't matter what you're doing it for. There's things that are so similar that you end up having a lot of commonality with people who do that as well, and like understanding people. Because really what organizing is about is people. And particularly, and this is something that I think is really important, unions are about people fundamentally, right? It's about raising people up. So I'd like to hear first why you are, because we haven't had anyone from your perspective on the podcast yet. What is it about unions that inspires you to, like you say, never want to do anything different? Like you dedicated your life to this and you loved it, and you're now, retired, and now you love it so much you're volunteering your time. Give us some of your passion. Like, what is it about this way of thinking that so inspires you to work so hard and to love it so much?
Well, that's a pretty complicated question, but
True.
I'll try and boil it down. Well, first of all, my kind of entry into the labor movement came about quite naturally as growing up as a working class kid in East Vancouver. And, my family was modest means. My father was a warehouse worker. My mother was a janitor. We were a working class family. And growing up in East Vancouver, notions of class, nobody had to teach me to be class conscious. We all knew that we were working class. And I knew it. My neighbors knew it. My friends knew it. So in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in the context of the civil rights movement in the United States and the war in Vietnam and just the hurly-burly of British Columbia, a certain level of politicalization came rather easily. And it led me directly to the labor movement. My father was a shop steward in his union. There was a huge strike struggle in 1983 in British Columbia. It was called the Solidarity Movement. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It was kind of a watershed event. Well, my dad was a picket captain, just, kind of one of the troops and so on. So, and as I became engaged with the labor movement and learned more about it, I started to attend meetings of the local labor council, which met on Commercial Drive, just up the street from where I lived. And I was just fascinated. I would sit in the back and listen to the speeches of these working class intellectuals, people who had almost no post-secondary formal education, but who were better read than anybody I'd ever met in school or elsewhere, and incredible orators who would combine theory, philosophy, history, and practice in a way that inspired people. And they would do it on the floor of union meetings that I would just sit in the back and listen to. So, I came to have a pretty profound respect for, for what working people are capable of. I learned early that formal education is no measure of people's ability. It's one measure, but it's no ultimate measure of people's ability. And basically, when you look at Canadian society, there is no other social organization comparable to the labor movement in terms of its size, its scope, its role as a social organization. When you look at a big union in Canada today and think about what it does for its members, it negotiates collective agreements and sets the terms and conditions for people at work. It also provides health and safety services to members, everything from ergonomics to toxic substances, the whole gamut of health and safety things the union does. The union provides legal services to its members. Trade unions are the largest adult educators in Canada.
Yes,
by far.
Absolutely, yes.
By far, tens of thousands of people go and so there are, expert people with a 150-year tradition of doing adult education. Large modern unions have human rights departments. In my union, there are 15. There are 5 standing committees in each region that are specifically for equity groups. So the union, by its constitution, always has a women's committee, an LGBTQ committee, a youth committee, a committee for disabled workers, and so on, and workers of color committees, plus all of. So when you just look at the scope and size of all of this, I'm leaving out pensions, benefits. Now these are all things that if you were kind of a professional person or a businessman, you would go out into the marketplace and purchase all of these services and as you need them. Trade unions provide them, for their members in a large way in Canada. And just try and think of our country without a labor movement that provides all of these services to people, empowering services that give workers strength and confidence to be able to do what they otherwise would not be able to do, which is to match power with truth and to negotiate on equal terms. So the labor movement is quite unique in that regard. And there's one other thing I should mention, which gripped me as a young man and which continues to motivate me more than ever today. And that is that you cannot disconnect trade unions in Canada today, although many people have tried to do this, but you cannot disconnect trade unions from a larger transformational notion of social change. The first unions were, came out of bitter, very oppressive, exploitative conditions. And from the very first day that there was a union, there was a vision of a new kind of a better world, a more fair world.
A better life for individuals, right?
A better life for individuals, but more than just a better life for individuals, the understanding that in order to achieve that better life, society has to change.
Right.
It has to change in structural ways, right? So, and so from the very beginning, trade unions had a certain anti-capitalist kind of a position. And as capitalism was modified by the work of trade unions over the years, that kind of relationship has evolved. But still until today, we look forward to a more democratic society in which class inequities are reduced and eliminated. And the trade union movement remains the fundamental social organization in Canada and globally that providing the social base for that kind of political movement.
Yeah, I think it's fair to argue that the union movement is what gave Canada single-payer healthcare too, right? Our universal healthcare system came out of that kind of, like you said, change, make society better, structural change, which is kind of born in that union movement. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Most things that are legislated were fought for at bargaining tables for years and years, long before they became socially legislated for all people. So whether you're talking about healthcare benefits or maternity, paternity leaves or pensions, all of these things that eventually became socialized for all people, as they should be, have their roots in working people coming together and demanding these things as a right and as a benefit of their employment. Because of course, all of these, employment security was something that, that wealthy classes and employers always had. They had employment security. Workers did not. So they, of course, in their workplace life and their struggles, they demanded it. And eventually, it became legislated and socialized for all people.
So a lot of people who are listening probably don't know the history of the labor movement in Canada, or kind of like an overarching idea of kind of how it's developed, who some of the main, figureheads are. So would you mind giving us a little bit of a background on how it's developed, and you being a part of it for so much of that time, watching it, what was that like? Just kind of give us the story of the labor movement in Canada, specifically Canada.
Again, a bit of a tall order to try and
absolutely
and boil down to a few words, but let me I'll give it a whirl here. So, and just interrupt me if I get too wonkish here.
Don't worry. We love the wonkish. We love the passion about these things. We want people to get into what the things they love.
So, the trade union movement in Canada is give or take a few decades, about 200 years old. It goes back to into the middle of the 19th century. And the first unions in Canada were outgrowths of guilds, European guilds. And, so it was at the very, capitalism was still, and the Industrial Revolution was just, was still very much underway. And we already had unions in Canada, but they were very craft oriented. So the first union members had usually were tradespeople, and they were shoemakers, they were leather workers, they were, although we even back at the very beginning, there were, forestry workers and others who started to organize unions. A lot of their demands were over hours of work. And so, the first strike for an 8-hour day was in the 1870s, in the 1880s, you had the famous Haymarket Massacre in Chicago, which was over the strike for the 8-hour day. And that gave rise to demonstrations around the world, which launched May Day as the day of International Workers' Day, as May Day, May 1st. Again, linking it to labor's more radical roots, the call for making May Day, this call to action on May the 1st came out from the International Working Men's Association in London, England, in response to the events in Chicago. And the head of that organization was a bearded guy called Karl Marx.
Right.
People think of him as just as somebody, who wrote books. And he did that, but he actually was the head of the first global labor movement at that time. So, following the early days of the trade union movement in Canada, almost all our unions were American unions.
Right.
They were almost all American. So they were kind of branch plants of American unions. And there was always this tension between, as Canadian labor began to form and its own bodies, how it would organize independently, and at the same time keeping solidarity with workers across the border. So in the early 20th century was perhaps one of the most radical eras of labor history. So in the United States, again, you had the International Working Men's Association, the IWW, International Workers of the World, which had been organizing in Canada. And it gave rise to a kind of a type of trade unionism known as syndicalism. There's a wonky word, syndicalism, meaning that people saw the union itself as a way to change society, as a substitute, in fact, for politics, for political parties.
Right. Yes.
So the IWW became, in Canada, eventually took on a different form called the One Big Union.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so this was very radical in its day, because you were taking the craft unions. Workers at the day said, what is this that we're all joining unions that based on I'm a shoemaker and you're a leather worker and this guy over here is a carpenter, and we're all in separate unions. We're all being, screwed over collectively in this society. Why don't we form one big union to fight for a different type of a union, a different type of society, I should say. And so it was trying to go from craft unionism all the way to kind of a class unionism, if I could use that term. And in that sense, it was very much before its time. But it did take over Western Canada,
absolutely.
And by about 1919, the One Big Union had about 35,000 members in Western Canada, which, Canada was had a much smaller population, and this was a very large, a very, very significant level of union density. And of course, the One Big Union was very much involved in the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. Very radical era. And again, workers coming back from World War I, which was, let's just say, World War I, when people came back, a lot of people were saying, well, we went to fight for king and country. But what was that really about? World War I was the first war of the first war in human history where there was, large numbers of death of civilians, not just combatants. It was the first, it marked a turning point in human conflict. And really it was for king and country, but it was really about colonialism, about redividing the world into colonies. A lot of workers came back and said, well, we went to that. We saw a lot of our people get, we saw a lot of our brothers fall. What's in it for us? And the workers, the soldiers that came back from the First World War were became quite radicalized.
Understandably, considering the conditions that they were under over there too, like they were treated. It was like you said, the working conditions even were just, as a soldier, were horrendous.
Exactly. So it wasn't only then a few years later, the syndicalists of the early 1920s, they went up by 1920 there was about 35,000 members in the One Big Union, but by 1926 or 27 they were reduced to about 4,000 or 5,000 people, mostly in Winnipeg. What happened to them? This is an interesting historic. Two things happened to that early movement. One thing was that first of all, the international unions, the American unions, fought back, and using their resources and their connections with governments of the day, and joined kind of in the campaigns against sort of the radicals, and they suppressed it. Another thing that happened, though, was that there was a decision made in Moscow at the Red International Labor Unions to actually telling the left-wingers, the radicals, the organizers, to leave the One Big Union and to go and rejoin the American unions, because that's in order to...
because they needed to be in those organizations to push things forward.
Yes, that's right. So it was one of the first times that, a problem of the Canadian labor movement where decisions were made on our behalf by people who knew better somewhere else.
Right.
Let's just put it that way. So now, then in so it was only a few years, and then we were, a few years later, it was less than a decade later, Canada found itself in the depths of the Depression. Mm-hmm. And the American unions, really didn't know what to do during the Depression, and there was almost no kind of worker resistance for the first few years. But people did start to organize again, and this was likely the heyday of the communist influence in the Canadian labor movement, and they started to organize and carry on strikes that would to the point where most of the strikes by 1933, 1934, 35 were being conducted by a group called the Workers' Unity League, which again, sort of similar to the One Big Union, by about 1935, 36 had about 35,000 members, mostly in Western Canada. They also organized the unemployed. And people have heard of the On to Ottawa trek, when they all got on, all the unemployed and homeless of the day, jumped onto rail cars, and they got as far as Regina when the RCMP met them. And there was the Regina riot and massacre. And unfortunately, as is often the case in those early struggles, shots were fired, workers sacrificed. As the Second World War approached, once again, global geopolitics affecting the development of the Canadian labor movement. There was a second decision made about the Canadian labor movement. Once again, not made in this country. And this was when the decision was made by now the Communist International decided that the called for the policy that was called the policy of the United Front. And it was that in order to fight fascism, to fight Hitler, that radical union members and more reformist and moderate union members had to come together and form a united front. And so, there was examples of that all over the world. In Spain, you had the Popular Unity Government that was until it fell victim to the Franco Franco's war. The fascists ultimately defeated it. But the Popular Unity Government was a government of communists, socialists, Democrats generally. This kind of popular front approach. In Canada, it meant that the Workers' Unity League voluntarily disbanded. And once again, for a second time, they decided to all go back and join the American unions again, and they did so. And many of them, of those same workers, went and fought in Spain as volunteers, and they also, of course, and became part of Canada's military effort. And during the war, that radical kind of component of labor organizers then became involved in the second kind of big era of trade unionism in Canada, going from craft unionism into industrial unionism.
Right.
So by now, the war economy started to produce mass production industries, automobiles, steel, and so on. And so unions began to organize not on a craft basis, but on a industrial basis. Okay, now these organizers, these radical organizers that I've mentioned, of course, they didn't go away. They just left their kind of radical organization, went back into, back into the mainstream unions, and they became critical organizers in that new wave of organizing. Once again, it was imported in part from the United States. There was an organization called the Congress of Industrial Organizing, the CIO, which started in the United States and came to Canada. And during that era, we had huge, quite a few large struggles, especially in the automobile industry in Southern Ontario, fighting for union recognition on an industrial basis. And just at the end of the war, there was a famous sit-down strike in Windsor at the Ford plant. And that sit-down strike was for union recognition. And that gave rise to a historic decision by the federal government to bring into being the basis of Canadian labor law today. It was called Privy Council Order 1007. And that was soon after reflected as well in a legal decision by a judge named Ivan Rand, which is called the Rand Formula. And it's from that point in time where we have the system that we have today, where if workers have the legal right and if to join a union, and if 50% if a majority of workers in any workplace, designated workplace, decide to join the union becomes a certified bargaining agent on behalf of all of the employees there. And what the Rand formula said is that even if you didn't join the union, because you were the beneficiary of that, of what the union was going to provide for you, your wages, your working conditions.
You had to pay your dues or whatever.
You had to pay your dues, and the union had a fiduciary responsibility to represent you whether you joined or not.
Right.
Okay, so this was the deal that was made in Canada. It was a different deal made slightly from the United States, which never had a Rand formula, not to this date, still doesn't. But in the United States, whereas unions got that right to form a union and to be certified as a bargaining agent, they, if they had a dispute, they could still, resort to a strike to resolve their disputes. In Canada, part of the deal was in exchange, it wasn't put so explicitly, but sort of part of the deal with the RAND formula was that everybody had to pay dues. There was no strike activity was allowed while a contract was in place.
Oh, and interesting.
So that which is a very different from the American system.
Yeah.
So for those that wanted it, it brought a certain level of labor peace. It meant that workers had the right to organize. A contract was signed, and then there was a level of labor peace, and that for disputes between that period, they would go to an arbitration system, which grew up kind of as a parallel part of the whole labor law system, which, today, 70, 80 years later, is a complicated network of thousands of precedents and arbitral practices and procedures and so on. And it's a great debate about whether or not workers have come out better in this very legalized technical system.
Right. What would your opinion on that be?
It's a bit of I have a foot in both camps. I think that that it's I don't, although I in favor of a militant labor movement that's always taking on the bigger fights. That doesn't mean that we have to, take everybody out on the street every time something relatively small happens. So I appreciate the technical arbitral system, but I'm always concerned that it takes over the life of the union, and too much of the work of the union gets turned over to lawyers and other technical experts, when really the best way to solve a problem is for a group of workers to go and knock on the boss's door and say, "You've got a problem, fix it or else."
Right. So the RAND Act was kind of almost a turning point in Canada where we got our own system. Like from what I'm hearing, from what you've told us, it was very much we were basically a plant economy for the American unions, and then we were trying to form our own thing. But once we had a legal structure, that probably took us in a different direction as unions than they did in the States. Would you say, or?
Absolutely. And so, so as I mentioned, this all took place within the context of the war. So the big struggles during the war, again, was still over the hours of work. So in 1948, for example, it was the kind of the critical turning point when most workers in Canada got an 8-hour day, the 40-hour week. The old saying that, unions, the group that gave you the weekend.
Right. I haven't heard that, but I like it.
It's literally true.
Yeah,
it's literally
right.
True.
Yeah, it's literally true.
So in 1948, there were 3 critical strikes that took place over the 8-hour day, and they were coordinated once again by the more radical and kind of more radical sort of socialist section of the labor movement, but it was all of the loggers in British Columbia.
Right.
The seamen on the Great Lakes in a group called the Canadian Seamen's Union. That's another story, a tragic story. And the garment workers in Quebec and Toronto. Okay. All of these 3 sections of the economy decided to strike in 1948 for the 8-hour day. The loggers won it, then the seamen won it, then the garment workers got it, and basically it was a done deal after that. It's then swept through the economy. But it's an illustrative point, because nobody should think that we got these things just because it made sense.
Right, or it was inevitable. It took work and effort and organizing.
It took a fight.
Yeah,
it took a fight. It took concerted action and a fight by people by leaders who understood the nature of class relations. And as Frederick Douglass famously said, power never seeds, anything without a demand.
Right, right.
And that was certainly the case in Canada. So, so industrial unionism then, the heyday of industrial unionism was basically from 1955 to 1975. There was the Canadian, that was during that year in some parts of Canada, union density climbed to almost 50% of the workforce.
Wow.
This was the post-war period of expansionism where the economy was growing, union demands were met, and it was in this era that people classically talk about the creation of the so-called middle class.
Right, right.
It's a term that I don't like because they were always working class and still are.
Right, because they're working all the time.
But they did achieve higher incomes, and that inequality, class inequality, was reduced to historic lows during this period of time. Industrial unionism grew in British Columbia, Quebec, in particular, in those places, Newfoundland. The union density was around 50% of all workers. And the other thing that took place in this period, particularly during the 1960s and 1970s, is when most of the big public sector unions formed in Canada. Okay.
Right. Yes.
And so start with hospital workers, municipal workers, federal government workers. It was during this period of time that these workers organized as well. And that was a huge change because, because when those workers decided to fight for union recognition, the governments of the day said, the way we're going to handle this is we can't deal with like 40 unions.
No,
in
right,
the hospital.
Right.
We can't deal with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to legislate one bargaining unit for everybody in the healthcare sector, or actually it was 2 or 3 bargaining units, one for nurses, one for the health professionals, and one for everybody else. So we're going to legislate these things. Or in the municipalities, they said we're going to have one bargaining unit for all of the civic workers.
Right.
Maybe another one for some white collar workers who are off by themselves, and so on. Likewise in the federal government, which actually the federal government had more unions according to different professional categories, and they had more, so they had a union for customs, a union for white collar workers, a union for researchers and professionals, and so on. But the overall impact was that basically the public sector became unionized almost, overwhelmingly, to the point where today 75% of the public sector in Canada is organized. People belong to unions. It's never reached 100%, but that part that is not unionized really was the sectors of the public sector areas where they would contract out government work to basically to service organizations and so on, because it was cheaper. And so from then until today, in the public sector, a big part of the union strategy is to fill in that gap instead of taking work of the important work that's done by public sector workers under a union contract and given to a social service agency that lives on grants and pays people half the wages.
Right.
That's always been the struggle, is to overcome that. So, and that sort of now the kind of the growth and expansion of industrial unionism through the 1960s and 1970s, of course, came to a crashing end around 1980, when, frankly, ruling elites in North America, in Europe, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, supported by a new ideological view that things were just not unequal enough. Things were just too equal. There was just too much democracy.
Right.
And that they were going to fix this, and so they did. And the so-called Washington Consensus was developed of free trade, deregulation, and union busting. Famously, Ronald Reagan decided to legislatively dissolve the air traffic controllers in the United States. Margaret Thatcher went after in big effort to destroy the coal miners' union in Great Britain. And there was a big pushback and it was at that you can actually mark the rise of inequality as we know it today from that era, from right around 1980, where inequality has grown obscenely ever since that time, and unions have generally been in decline. Okay.
Why do you think that? Obviously, there's a big pushback, and I completely agree. Why do you think the decline happened? Is there other reasons, or is it because of this pushback, do you think?
Yes. Well, the overall reason is organized greed.
Right.
Okay, organized greed and a new ideology of capitalism, which we sometimes call neoliberalism, which is that greed is good.
Right.
Greed is good. I mean, famously, Milton Friedman and others and the Chicago School of Economics, they actually argued and trained a whole generation of kind of MBA graduates that greed is good, that the best decisions are made in the best decisions, social decisions are made by people seeking their maximum self-advantage.
Right.
And that somehow in this great wash of all of that, the efficiencies would be created and wealth would be created and it would trickle down to the people at the bottom.
Right.
It was all a hoax, resulting in this obscene inequalities we have today, and the fact that in the United States today, it's better in Canada, but in the United States today, the real purchasing power, the real income of the average worker in the United States today is about what it was in about 1975 or 1976.
Yeah, that's something I've always thought was completely absurd, to be honest. It doesn't make any sense to me at all how wages have stagnated for so long.
Well, because yes, wages have stagnated for so long, and so and they stagnated for so long because while these economic policies were implemented, that they were complemented by legislation, direct anti-labor legislation. So it became harder and harder to organize a union. In the United States, you had right-to-work laws, which outlawed what we would call in Canada union shops, made them illegal. Kind of right-wing libertarianism on steroids, finding its way into the application of labor law. In Canada, it took a different expression. We never really had right-to-work legislation, but we did have for example, in British Columbia, the governments in the 1980s legislated non-union. They basically broke up the organized construction industry and created huge industrial projects in which gave the contracts to non-union contractors, many of them imported from the United States and Korea and places like that, because we didn't have a lot of non-union contractors in British Columbia capable of doing that.
Right.
But it was social engineering on a wide scale. They determined to do this. Why? Because they thought construction workers were too powerful, earned too much money, frankly, and they wanted cheaper construction.
Yeah.
And there were many other, the right to strike became more and more constrained, and so on. And it was in the public sector, there was strike breaking against postal workers. Famously, a number of labor leaders in Quebec, Jean-Claude Perrault, the leader of the postal workers, they all went to jail.
Right.
As strikes were broken and legislated. Okay, so all of this coercion, in combination with the new economic policies, brought about a decline in the labor movement. Fundamentally, the tactic was, and it was successful, put the fear of God into workers, that if they fought for better wages, more security, they would have less job security, they would lose their jobs.
Right.
And you also, of course, had capital flight in order to underscore this with people, the free trade agreement, of course, with the United States, although it brought some benefits. I acknowledge there were some benefits from trade. Some new sectors opened up. Canada lost, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 manufacturing jobs, which was simple capital flight going to low-wage jurisdictions.
Right. Yeah.
Something that everybody now is trying to figure out how we can reverse.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
So this was the case, and so now there's one other part. I'm sorry, this has taken a long time.
No, this is awesome. This is great.
Okay, so let's fast forward into the 21st century. Okay, so into the 21st century, we have you have a new situation where the labor movement is much weakened. Trade union density overall has declined in the United States down to about 10%, 12% of all workers, with 5-6% of private sector workers organized, maybe 20% of public sector workers organized. In Canada, overall union density has remained about 29%, but that's because 70 to 75% of public sector workers remain in unions. Private sector density in Canada has dropped to about 18 or 19%. In Ontario, it's 14%. In British Columbia, it would be about the same, 14, 15%, and so on. Which means that 85% of roughly of workers do not have unions. They supposedly have a legal right to join a union, but practically speaking,
they're not really involved in it. Yeah.
They don't. And there also came about, there became new forms of management organization in order to kind of, cement this relationship and to just kind of squeeze the last drop of blood out of the stone. So there's a term for it. It's called the fractured workplace. Okay. And so you have a workplace, think of a big box store. Okay. Just in time supply. Everything is contracted out.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Okay. Everything is contracted out, just in time suppliers. So you, it's difficult to know where is the decision made that sets the terms of work, that sets the wages that's going to be paid, the hours of work, the other general conditions, is it the manager in the store? Is it the purchaser that sets the supply chain, or is it the contractors that come in, with doing various services of maintenance or providing particular services or goods? So, in other words, the nature of work was reorganized.
Right.
Okay. And to divide workers and production up into smaller groups of people. So today in Canada, about 89% of all workplaces have 19 or fewer employees. Now that's not of all workers. They make up still only about 35 to 40% of the entire workforce. So 60% of workers are in bigger workplaces, but the great majority of workplaces,
are small,
are very, very small. Okay, so does that mean that they have no there are no rights as is. In fact, many of those small workplaces are extremely exploitative. Sometimes they're, and sometimes they can be, kind of little families that operate as a group, and it's all, kumbaya between everybody. But I think we all know somebody that works in a small workplace that it's not that way at all. Mm-hmm. But given the nature, the structure, and the history of where we come from in the era of industrial unions, those places are virtually unorganizable given the current model of trade unionism that we have today. Virtually unorganizable.
So what do you think, we have to end here in about 10 minutes, but what do you think the future of the trade union is or unions in general, given this fractured world that's been created? And it sounds like, and it seems perfectly rational to me, that you think this came from this legalization of the whole process, this making it overly bureaucratic.
No, that contributed, but no, I would say I wouldn't put it to that. I would put it to kind of a development of capitalism, which, put it this way, in the capitalist society, and this is the sort of my ideological bent, right, there's only one way really to make a lot of money. Okay, people think they're making, and the only way you can make a lot of money in capitalism is that you hire workers and you, frankly, pay them less. Right. And if you're investing in the stock market and getting money there, that's really just redistribution of income that's already made from what takes place in production.
Right.
So that this process is inevitable. It's always going on. It's why we always need a labor movement. So what's the future of labor? Well, this takes me back to the story I started to talk to you about with the syndicalists in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. We've gone through a period of unionism from craft unionism into industrial unionism. And today, you have a majority of the working class. A majority of the working class are in small workplaces and in franchise operations working for various forms of self-employment, which is just another form of employment these days. Maybe you guys yourselves,
we're
gig workers.
Yeah.
You're gig workers. You're
yep.
still workers.
Yeah.
You're still workers. And so maybe those syndicalists in the 1920s who, organized the Winnipeg General Strike, they were before their time. But I would say that in order for the labor movement's future, I would argue we need to evolve to the next stage, which would be a class unionism. Okay, so this would be, for example, what I devoted the last part of my career to with the creation of Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union. It was a merger wasn't really a merger. It was a creation of a new union, the first major new union in Canada in over half a century. And this union, though, although it was a group of industrial unions that came together to make it, couldn't be called an industrial union because it has members in over 20 economic sectors.
Right. So it's not industry specific at all.
It's not industry specific at all. No. And in fact, you guys can join.
Right. Right.
We have a freelance union, a freelance local, which is part of the union structure. But the idea is, it's called, the slogan is a union for everyone. And now, unfortunately, most of the American unions that remain in Canada today have no interest in this type of unionism. I call them legacy unions. Legacy unions, and many of the Canadian unions as well. They still haven't yet felt the crisis bite hard enough because, Frank, the dues-paying members of the shrinking section of the organized working class that they represent can still keep the lights on.
Right. But it's just maintaining the status quo. They're not making gains anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, and they can make gains in this contract or that contract, but the point is they're taking care of the members as they should, but the group of members that they're taking care of are every year a little smaller percentage of the whole working class. And what we need to do, if we want to see the resurgence of the middle class that everybody says that they want, that we want to see working people stand together in much greater numbers and take much more decisive actions in order to counteract inequality in all its forms. If we want to see the labor movement once again become a social movement for progressive change, rather than an interest group helping a small group of craft workers, in some section of the economy. If we want to do these things, labor has to embrace a class unionism where we say our unions are for everybody.
Right.
And we fight for everybody, whether you belong to the union or not. We are your representative, and we will help empower you through our organizing, our education, our political action, and our struggles to fight for greater equality in a fairer world. So, history does repeat itself.
Right. Or at least it rhymes, right? At least it rhymes.
At least it rhymes. And we can learn a lot from our history.
I'm very grateful for this. This has been, I don't know, I'm sure Zach feels the same way. This has been massively educational for me. I actually did some of my master's on how wealth inequality was going to result in the collapse of our economies. Now I'm not. I think we're ideologically different, but the level of inequality is something that deeply bothers me as well. There's no reason that wealth should be so concentrated in such a small number of people. And I grew up very working class myself. I liked what you said. We're all workers. And we need to remember that the labor movement has played such a significant role. I mean, giving us the weekend. That's such a good way of putting it, right? So yeah, I'm just really grateful that you came on here, and I feel very much more enlightened by your wisdom, to be honest, on this stuff. So thank you.
Well, great, and I look forward to wherever you take this from here. I look forward to the feedback. And and maybe I'll just tell people you asked for my social media contacts.
Yes.
On Twitter, FWilson2. FWilson2 is my Twitter handle. People can find me there. I'm on Facebook at JE Wilson. And I did write a book that hopefully some of your listeners will find entertaining. It's called A New Kind of Union.
Oh,
A New Kind of Union, and a lot of what I've been talking about is captured there. It's the story of how Unifor was founded, why it was founded, and where the labor movement has come from and where it's going. It was published by James Lorimer and Company in 2019. A New Kind of Union.
A New Kind of Union by Fred Wilson. People, if you want to better understand the movement and what and this evolution that has happened in the Canadian labor movement, then you should definitely pick up that book.
Please do. It's available at Chapters, Indigo, or online from Lorimer.
Perfect.
And you can find me pretty easily by through Unifor. Just look on the web. And if anybody out there wants to talk more about this, get in touch with me, and I'll be glad to carry on the conversation.
Fred, it's been an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.